Excellent. Thank you very much, Sandra. Let me get this out of the way. And I'll just do a slight recap of what last week let me back up even further. I know this course presents a very provocative thesis, and I'm not backing away from it. I make the presentation that that John F. Kennedy's murder was part of a vast conspiracy that involved many members of the highest levels of our government, both in the military and the intelligence community. And at the apex of this conspiracy was Vice President Johnson. And as we go forward, I will present direct evidence to support that thesis. Now, to understand how I'm going to build this case, last week, I wanted to give a sense of how information has come forward to us as a nation beginning 60 years ago. And just briefly, of course, we had that weekend when there was contradictory evidence coming and being reported on the both print and electronic media. The following year, with the Warren Commissions and their delivery of the report to the president, we had an executive summary of more than 900 pages that was allegedly supported by 26 additional volumes and 50,000 pages. And that came to the conclusion, although we now know that that was a predetermined conclusion, that it was one shooter, 3 bullets, no conspiracy. And that was the marching orders given to the members of the Warren Commission. Any information that supported that, they accepted. Anything that went against it, they rejected. During the mid-70s, as a result of the Church Commission raising many issues regarding political assassinations, there was the formation of the House Select Committee on Assassinations that was specifically looking at both JFK and MLK Jr.'s assassination. And that process was negatively affected by Congress itself by eliminating their chief counsel, Richard Sprague. He came in to do business and Congress wasn't ready for that. So he was asked to step down, and many of his chief investigators stepped down with him. However, there was some positive information that came along the way. In 1991, there was the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, and this brought to the public's attention, once again, the subject of JFK's murder. And there was a didactic panel at the very end of it that said, but of course, X number of documents were going to be held from public view until the year 2039. And the generation that was watching this movie said, why do we need to wait 40 more years for this? And they called up their congressperson, wrote letters, and it brought about the JFK Act. That's a short name for the act that was then. And that led to the Assassination Records Review Board in the mid-90s. And that non-governmental panel of 5 people had the authority to demand from every government agency all records regarding the assassination. And that brought forward millions of documents that then researchers have had the ability to be going through, and a number of publications since then. And as I said, this course is based largely upon the work of those researchers. But one of the things that I did mention last week, and I'll give a shout out to it right now, and I'll mention it. One of the early responders to this, in addition to Mark Lane, was a woman named Sylvia Marr. Now, her spelling of her last name is unusual for how it's pronounced. It's M-E-A-G-H-E-R. It's an Irish name, but pronounced Marr. And she wrote the subject index, but in the follow-up to that, she wrote a book published in 1966, perhaps 66, and it was called Accessories After the Fact. And it's a marvelous book. And all she had to work with was the Warren Commission. And she used, as Harold Weisberg did, used the Warren Commission to take apart the Warren Commission. So when this course is over, I'll put it in the show. As you know, each week I will put out show notes that will accompany the recording. And I'll put some links in there and some references that you might choose to follow up with later. Anyway, that's kind of where we were at. With today, I will be giving a short biography of our mastermind, that is Lyndon Baines Johnson, so that we have an understanding of who this person is. Now, I dare say, unless you've read a biography, you know none of this information. There are two main biographies in which most of this material is drawn. Of course, there's the noted biographer, Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, and he's a relatively benevolent biographer for JFK. And then secondly is Robert Dallek, D-A-L-L-E-K. And you'll see his name come up on the screen here in just a moment. Both of these gentlemen give us a lot of insight into who this character, what the character of LBJ was. And it's not the sort of biography that you're going to get if you go to a visit at the Presidential Library in Texas. I'll give you that. So, and again, if there's any questions that come up, don't hesitate to ask me. Today's presentation will be recorded, so you'll be able to review it if you'd like to see it. So let me come down and I'll share my screen. And then I'm just going to reduce my gallery image right here. And again, the title of this class, Dallas, JFK's Assassination Through a Glass Darkly. And again, I used the reference to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and that we have a pretty good idea of what happened, but there's still something between it and us, a glass darkly. But sometime in the future, that will go away, and there'll be only ourselves and the truth. And at that time, not only will we know, but we as a nation will be known. And I'm not sure we want to know what it is that truth is going to reveal to us, but there it is. And with episode 2, we're looking at LBJ's maniacal obsession. The early years. When he was 12 years old, Lyndon Johnson proclaimed to some friends, "Someday, I'm going to be president of the United States." And the kids who he was playing with said, "I'm not going to vote for you." To which he replied, "I won't need your votes," as if he already knew how to steal elections. In his early 20s, LBJ would go to Saturday night dances, and here he is, all duded up, where he would, instead of dancing, he would just strut around and tell anyone who would listen that he was going to be president of the United States one day. Now, there's no record of how the young adults on the dance floor responded, or whether or not they voted for him, or if they even paid attention to him. But at this age, he began learning the skills of manipulation and persuasion. And he learned it at his daddy's hand. And here is Sam Johnson, who at this time was a Texas state senator, who LBJ would follow on a few occasions up to the Capitol in Austin and mimicked his style of physical conversation. And by that, what's meant, Sam would put his hand around the other man's neck or shoulder, or grab the man's lapel and pull him right up to nose as they talked. And here's an image of LBJ as president, and you can see him using that physical style of conversation against another elected right there. He would strut him, that is, "Sam, Johnson would strut and bluster with other politicians in Houston. And with that, young LBJ got a taste of what the power of elective office was like. But while Lyndon was copying his father's political style, the state's economic recession would open a chasm between them that would never be healed. In fact, the disintegration of his father's career would deeply affect LBJ. And that is Sam Johnson right there at the Austin Capitol building. And what had happened was this. With the collapse of the agricultural markets in 1920, this of course is in the wake of World War I, where prices were artificially high because of demand, and it forced the sale of the family farm in 1922. And although it's not a great image here, this gives us a glimpse of what that dwelling was like on the family farm. And this was very embarrassing to the family, and LBJ in particular, especially when the following year his father's political career collapsed. And I'll add to this, one of the ways in which his father was trying to ameliorate his pain is that he turned to alcohol and he turned to high spending, money that he didn't have. And what would happen is that the family would leave where they were renting at and go to another town, and his father would run up debts that he could not pay, and they'd have to move again. Well, after a wee bit of that, LBJ just took off with some of the other hill country boys. Undoubtedly, their families were suffering the same sort of deprivation, and he hoped to make a new life in California, but without any skills or much of an education. I dare say he might have just ended up in the vast orange groves of Orange County and Riverside County that existed at that time. But after a few unprosperous years, LBJ decided in 1927 to return home and enroll at Southwest Texas State Teachers College in San Marcos. A big decision here. And there's an image of the Southwest State Teachers College. It was a relatively new college, didn't have a lot of financial support. The instructors there were not as well paid as at other colleges in Texas, but this is where LBJ could enter. And he had a cousin who was at this school who was on the football team. He, in fact, was captain of the football team, and as we know how football is treated in Texas, the captain of that football team had certain privileges, and he was aware of a rent-free apartment above the college president's garage. And that's who we see in the image here. And he arranged for LBJ to stay there. And because of this proximity to the college president and the college president's wife, he got to know them very well. And the single most important thing that Johnson learned while at this school was how to flatter and control powerful men, because LBJ was learning how to be a psychopath and all that it would bring. During his years, he became more skillful at manipulating people, especially those in superior position, but also those below him. And he did this through bestowing favors, using trickery, bribery, or just outright deceit. I think what we see from the very beginning, LBJ was an amoral man. He would use whatever it took to arrive at what he was after. The ends justified the means. He was not well liked by his classmates. He was considered, they knew him as a manipulator, a brown noser, and his classmates intensely hated him. As I noted, Robert Carroll, he comments on this, because you may or may know, when Carroll would follow a portion of LBJ's life. He just physically moved to that area and lived there for anywhere from a year to 2 years in order to embed himself in that environment. He did that. And he writes this: by the time the researcher completes his work on Johnson's college years, he knows that one alumnus had not been exaggerating when he said, a lot of people at San Marcos didn't just dislike Lyndon Johnson, they despised Lyndon Johnson. And I have to ask myself, I can't think of anybody that I despise, and I hope there's nobody out there in the world that despises me. But here's this young man, Lyndon Johnson, and there are people decades after he's gone to school there that they still hold those strong emotional feelings toward him. He must have made some kind of impression when he was there. After graduating from San Marcos, he got a job in Houston at Sam Houston High School, both teaching and coaching. And one of his extracurricular activities was coaching the debate team. And here we see him. He is the tall gentleman in the rear, standing above 4 of his members of his debate team. And what's interesting, I want to point out here, are the 2 young men on either side, because we're going to follow them in this story. The taller of the 2 young men is L.E. Jones, and the man on the right is Eugene Latimer. Let's find out about them a little bit here in a moment. Well, he was just about to begin his 2nd year of teaching at Sam Houston when suddenly the newly elected congressman from that district, a gentleman named Richard Clayburgh, gave LBJ a job as an administrative aide as he's forming his new staff. LBJ quit teaching, moved to Washington, and he moved into a rundown hotel. LBJ has always got his eye on the purse. He also worked long hours for the congressman, who, as we can well imagine, had virtually no power since he was newly elected and he's down on the totem pole of seniority. LBJ was thrust into this job as an aide with no training on even the fundamentals of the position. He couldn't type, didn't know how to dictate a letter, or how to respond to the hundreds of incoming letters seeking assistance from some federal agency or bureau. One can imagine this young man, he's like 22, 23 years old, and he is trying to figure out this job in this large fishbowl of the Capitol. And what we see here is the Capitol at that time, the late 20s. But Johnson was a very clever man, and using his wiles and whatever tools he could master, he learned the role on his own. And boy, did he learn it. Johnson really learned how, we all think about Washington in idealistic terms. We're all like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. We're like Jimmy Stewart going to Washington. Johnson, he may have gone there like Jimmy Stewart, but it didn't take him long to figure out the way to get things done is not the way it's in our civics textbook. At any rate, the longer he was there, his confidence level grew, and so did his audacity. And LBJ even began impersonating his boss, Congressman Clayburgh, on the phone, mind you, whenever he needed another congressman to do something that he felt was particularly important. That kind of tells you the audacity that Johnson had at a very young age. Eventually, he brought 2 of the students he had taught in Houston. There may have been other staff members that Clayburgh had hired, but Johnson saw to it that they were let go, and he brought in these 2 young men whom he had in Houston to work as secretaries underneath him. Now they've reversed himself. That's Gene Latimer on the left and L.E. Jones on the right. And what's pertinent to us is that LBJ would import young men from Texas because it gave him more control rather than hiring people who lived in the Washington area, because these people, they could tell LBJ to, I'm quitting, I'm out of here. Where these guys, they were far from home and very dependent on LBJ. LBJ did not want to put them on the payroll, though. LBJ wanted to keep that money for himself. So what he did, he found them other jobs, namely in the House Post Office, and they were paid $130 a month. And there, both Gene and L.E., they worked from 5 a.m. till noon. And then they had a 30-minute lunch, and then they came to work for LBJ for the rest of the day, usually until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And they were happy to do it. But Johnson always had a very demeaning treatment of these young men and all the people who would work under him. And nevertheless, these people would remain loyal to him. Here's an example. Gene Latimer, he feared, but also idolized Johnson. And he acted as though he were completely under LBJ's control. Now, the image that I'm showing here is from Johnson's presidency, but look how he's in the face of this subordinate right here. And look at the downcast eyes of the subordinate who's just having to take it. One thing that I will focus on a little more in today's presentation, LBJ had a great talent for identifying weaknesses in people, and he would exploit those weaknesses. And I dare say that LBJ had a sense for recognizing people who had very low self-esteem, perhaps even coming from dysfunctional families where there had been a domineering parent, and he knew exactly how to push their buttons. And that he did. He could convince, in this case, Latimer, to perform any of his requests that they were simply the right thing to do. And if Latimer ever fell out of line, LBJ would make him feel so bad that Latimer claimed that he wanted to just go on out and shoot himself. And I have to ask, have any of us ever worked for someone that made us want to do that? Well, Eugene Latimer certainly did, and I dare say there were others. Well, anyway, despite this extreme pressure, Latimer invariably would return to LBJ's office because he felt that he could not do anything else. And Latimer would become the model for the kind of aide that LBJ would value, one who would unconditionally accept whatever orders were given to him without regard to issues of ethics or legality. Now, there's a few exceptions, but as we'll see, most of the people that LBJ will surround himself were usually smaller men. Now, LBJ was 6'2", 6'3", and he used that height advantage all the time, but he intentionally used it by hiring smaller people. Here's an example of it in this image we see right here. I don't know if any of you recognize this gentleman who's standing beside LBJ. This, again, is from his presidency, but that is Jack Valenti, serving him as an assistant. And once he leaves LBJ's office, he will receive a plum position with the Motion Picture Academy here in Hollywood. Anyway, among LBJ's treatment of these first assistants on Capitol Hill is typical of how he would treat them throughout his career, whether congressman, senator, vice president, and as president. And I'll tell you a little anecdote here. LBJ, he used to humiliate the people around him, and Jack Valenti in particular. On at least one occasion, he'd say, Jack, get over here. Get on all fours. I want something to put my boots up on. And Valenti, with a little laugh, he'd get down on all fours, and LBJ would treat him like an human ottoman. And everybody would have a big laugh, but LBJ was conveying what he wanted to convey. All of you guys are so subordinate to me. February 22nd, 1937, LBJ has this stroke of good luck when the congressman representing the 10th congressional district died in office. And LBJ immediately announced his candidacy and assembled a campaign organization. And he told his boys, and they were exclusively boys at this time, that he wanted his picture everywhere in the district. We can get a glimpse of one of his handbills right here. I want it so you can't wipe your ass on a piece of paper that hadn't got my face on it. And I love the text that's on this handbill right here. He gets things done. I love the one next below it. He knows Washington. Indeed, Johnson had spent these first years working as Clayburgh's assistant to figure out how Washington really worked and how to get things done. And it isn't Jimmy Stewart. But here's the other thing. Johnson, he aligned himself so firmly with the then president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he advertises it here. Support the man who stands with the president and for the people, and wholehearted for the Democratic platform of 1936. It was a long and a bitter campaign. I noted LBJ aligned himself with FDR, worked himself sick, and he spent between $75,000 and $100,000. And this was the most expensive congressional race conducted in Texas history at that time. And look at this photograph here. I mean, this tells you what the results are going to be. His opponents had concentrated, and there were about 4 other opponents, and they were all vying for the Democratic nomination. In Texas at this time, it was largely a one-party state. So if you got the Democratic primary, then you went on to win the general. And so there were 5 candidates in the primary. LBJ's strategy was to focus on the rural area because it was the only way to win with so many competitors. And that strategy paid off for him because all his competitors went for the easy votes where he spent his time out in the country. And he won that vote, 29,000 cast, and LBJ won it by a margin of 3,000. I dare say this is the only clean election that LBJ ever ran, was this one right here. But it puts him in Congress. And here we see on the left, he's with Lady Bird. He's coming to Congress now. And this is a photograph from 1934, which is when they married. And there is him in his office now as Congressman Johnson, ready to do the people's business. But upon taking this seat, LBJ inherited a big problem involving the construction company owned by Herman and George Brown, who we see in this image here. And when I say Herman and George Brown, I'd like you to think Brown and Root, and today think Halliburton. So this company's still with us. These brothers would become some of Johnson's strongest backers, along with owners of Texas oil companies. Now, here's the problem. LBJ's predecessor had approved the start of construction for a dam before it had been approved and funded by a congressional committee. And congressional committees don't like to be bypassed. Instead, there's just been an informal approval by the president. LBJ pushed FDR to override what was seeming to be an insurmountable legal issue, because you better believe that congressional committee wanted to yank that project back and spend no more money on it. But he managed to get FDR to issue a presidential order. And this was Johnson's first congressional victory. And by doing so, he was able to repay Brown and Root for its early support. And what will become known as the Marshall Dam Project was that company's first major project. And check this out down at the bottom. Brown and Root netted $2 million in profit. So I'm sure there were change orders that came along that boosted that up. But this is in 1936 dollars. So it's, well over $20 million in 2023 finances. So they made a lot of money. However, LBJ inherited a poor staff when he took that seat. So as before, he just got rid of that staff and he sought to correct it in his usual way. He looked for young Texas men, all men, and most recent graduates, especially campus newspaper editors and student leaders from the University of Texas in Austin. That was his hiring pool, UT Austin. And take a look at who his first hire was. This gorgeous gentleman right here, John Connally. I don't know whether you know this about, well, John Connally, first of all, I'm going to point out, he was student body president at UT Austin. But along with his then girlfriend, later to be his wife, Nellie, Connally aspired to be in the theater. He came from my world. He wanted to be an actor. But he was hired to be an administrative aide for Johnson. What's something I want to point out here, Connally's campaign manager when he was at UT was this gentleman here, Henry Wade, who would later go on to serve as Dallas County District Attorney for, I think, almost 30 years. I think it's something like 26 years. And he had a big influence on who went to prison in that county. And he also, of course, is going to bear on the assassination of President Kennedy. But that's down the road here. Those that followed Connally in being hired were mostly friends or acquaintances of someone who had already joined his staff either in Austin or in DC. So you had to be part of the family in order to join the family. And as always, we'd seen earlier, LBJ would arrange to place these men in other government jobs, and more importantly, on other payrolls. Johnson was keeping all of this payroll money for himself, but he was getting strategic value in placing them in other government jobs because he could evaluate them and also use them as intelligence sources, while admonishing them to avoid becoming known as Johnson's men, because I'm sure the word was getting around exactly what LBJ was doing in DC at this time. And primarily, two agencies is where he placed them: the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, and also the Ag Department, USDA. Johnson made it clear to them that they were beholden to him for these jobs. Oh my goodness. Here come the war years. And I put war in quotation marks because Johnson had a war like nobody else. But look at this photograph here. Doesn't this look like he's just landed on the beach here and he's greeting, the commanding officers, and he wants, they want his opinion on things. Well, let's get a closer look at LBJ's war years. After Pearl Harbor, he decided, my political career would, it could use a boost from a stint in the Navy. Other people are being drafted, but he thought, I might sign up. So he visited his friend, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Johnson was continuing his manipulation and brown-nosing in DC, just as he had at San Marcos, and he'd gotten to know Admiral Nimitz. And Nimitz signed forms necessary to install him as a lieutenant, commander, even though he had no training and no experience. But take a look at that photograph here. Boy, he sure looks like the part, doesn't it? Man, that looks good. I wonder where he got that from. Soon after, LBJ went to the Navy, turned to another superior, in this case, Undersecretary James Forrestal, to get orders to conduct an inspection tour of West Coast training program. You know, we don't want to get too close to the war zone. And he took along his administrative assistant, John Connolly, who enlisted in the Naval Reserve. These two boys are going to have the time of their life on the West Coast. They spent their time in Los Angeles because one of LBJ's financial supporters was a counsel, an attorney for Paramount Pictures. And he arranged for Johnson and Connolly to attend screenings and parties. And LBJ, along with Connolly, they had long sessions with a Hollywood photographer and a voice coach to help improve their speaking style and their posing skills. That was how they spent 1942, baby. Nice work if you can get it. Anyway, after 5 months of partying, Johnson tried to legitimize his responsibility by securing an overseas assignment. You know, he's always looking down the road. What's going to serve me best? So he was dispatched with 2 other congressmen as observers. And this, of course, would make them useful to General MacArthur in relation to his own political necessities of lobbying for more resources. Because as you'll recall, at this time, our focus was on Europe. And so the administration was trying to get as much supplies into Europe, both to the Allies in England, and of course, through the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union. But MacArthur wanted material coming to him in the South Pacific. And for this, LBJ was rewarded with a Silver Star. Historian Robert Dallek, who I mentioned at the outset, noted a deal was made between LBJ and General MacArthur. And the deal was Johnson would get this medal, which somebody later said was the least deserved and most talked about medal in American military history. So, you know, that's something right there. And MacArthur, in return, had a pledge from Johnson that he would lobby FDR to provide greater resources for the South Pacific Theater. But again, look at this image here. You can see that those posing skills were beginning to pay off for Johnson. He looks like the lieutenant commander right there. Got that nice background of a world map showing behind him there. He's ready to go into action. But then we have a little change up here, because post-war, LBJ yearned to achieve his next step in his political ascent. He wanted to get to the Senate. Now, in 49, before the U.S. involvement in the war began, he did run for the Senate at that time, with Connolly as his campaign manager. And in doing so, they stole thousands of votes. But unfortunately, they just didn't steal enough. And they lost the election by just a little more than 1,300 votes. And look at that face that Johnson has down there in that lower right-hand column. He does not like losing. He doesn't like concession speeches. So this lesson taught him a lesson, because 7 years later, he was prepared to steal as many votes as he needed to secure that seat. So here comes along in 48. He declares his candidacy, and he recruits 3 key individuals to serve him, names that we're going to keep running into: Cliff Carter, Horace Busby, and most important of all, Malcolm Wallace, who we most familiar will know as Mac Wallace. These henchmen would remain with LBJ throughout his career. For in a sense, once LBJ has his arms around you, there's no letting go. This is two very interesting images that I found right here of LBJ campaigning for that Senate seat. In Texas, there was a startup helicopter company known as Bell Helicopters. Now, they're struggling financially, and this is one of their major prototype helicopters here. And Johnson persuaded the owner of Bell Helicopters to let him use that while he went around from small town to small town campaigning. And what he would do, he would fly around the small town. People would say, "What is that thing?" And they'd gather by a nearby field. Johnson be waving his Stetson out the window, and then he'd let that Stetson just fly out into the crowd below. They'd land the helicopter. Johnson would get out, make a stump speech, but before getting back on that helicopter, he would always tell one of his on-the-scene aides, "You go find my Stetson. I'm not giving that away." And they take off in the air again and go to the next small town. So that's how Johnson campaigned for Senate in 48. But that's not what's going to get him into office. 3 days after the balloting, the 48 election was about to be called for Johnson's opponent, who was the very popular Governor Coke Stevenson. Now, Coke Stevenson had made the fatal Texas error of announcing his final tally. And he said, "We won by 113 votes. Now, this is surprising out of 1 million that were cast in a long campaign. And I say it's a fatal action in any kind of Texas election. You always wait until your opponent declares, and then you just go out and you find the right number that you need to win. And that's exactly what Johnson did. Yeah. He knew the number that he needed to win by, and he had already made arrangements with this gentleman here, George Parr, familiarly known as the Duke of Duval County. He had asked Parr to help him in the race, and Parr had agreed because he controlled not only Duval, but several other surrounding counties. So Johnson pushed him to help. Parr agreed, and in the process, Parr came up with the famous Precinct 13 ballot box. And when they counted those votes, Johnson not only overcome the 113 that he was behind, but he had 200 more. That's a very famous image of that Precinct 13. Anyway, Coke Stevenson, I'm just as an offside here, Coke Stevenson did not go quietly. He fought this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in the source book, and I'm presuming you have at your hand the syllabus and sources. If you don't, let me know. But one of the number one book I have on this is by Philip Nelson, and he goes into this election campaign a great deal. I don't want to do it for our time limitation here, but he explicates that quite well for us. So LBJ won by 200 votes, and it all came out of Precinct 13 in Duval County. He will go on from this, as people always refer to him as Landslide Lyndon. Robert Caro wrote that even in terms of the most elastic political morality, the political morality of 1940s Texas, Johnson's methods were immoral. There he is doing some campaigning in a local barbershop. Of course, this will bring us to the Senate here. This is a good time just to take a little break right here. Let me come up in here and open up my gallery a little bit here for you and see if there are any questions that any of you have at this time. And if you need to step away, do so, but I'll remain by here. Anybody have anything they'd like to add to this? I look down here. I don't see anything in the chat so far.
There's so much I could add.
Anybody want to speak up? Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
John, this is Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
how do you, well, you use the term stole the votes.
Mhm.
What is the evidence, or how do you know that he stole the votes?
Well, essentially what happened is they just had a lot of votes put in there. They're done, it's done in a variety of ways. And rather get into too many specifics about it, I'll refer back to that Philip Nelson book right there, because he goes into it. And actually, a lot of people have written about this, but they do it in one of two ways. They just take ballots for which there is no registered voter, and they fill them out and they stuff the box with them. The second way, and we will see this play out in the 1960 presidential election, because that election will be stolen as well. But I'll get into that in episode 4. And that's done by having ballots associated with people who are either in the poorhouse, or they've died, or they're in prison, and you fill out a ballot for them. But the most common way, particularly in Texas, is just to take ballots for which no one is associated, and then mark them up for your candidate and stuff them into a precinct in a place such as Duval County. It doesn't take much, believe me. Today, that may not be the case, but it sure was the case back in 1948 going through 1960.
This is Lori. Could you say a little more about his father? Has his father passed at this point?
Lori, I can't go too much into talking about Sam Johnson. He did, suffer alcoholism, and he was an embarrassment to LBJ himself. And there was this tremendous rift between father and son, brought about by the financial ruin, and then I'll call it the personal ruin of his father, who, as I said, would move the family to get out from underneath debt. They go to the new town, and the father just starts, racking up more debt, and it became a great embarrassment. Money, and we'll see this weigh on Johnson psychologically, because money is so important to LBJ. We're seeing that play out already when he's holding all the clerical payroll to himself. He never wants to be in the position that his father was in. But as for his father's demise, I couldn't even tell you the year that his father passed in, but all this is so easily accessible elsewhere. So,
Okay, thank you.
okay. Anybody else? Let me ask, has anybody here read any of Caro's biographies of LBJ?
I read the trilogy.
Did you?
Yeah.
Do you want me to say that?
No, just you're trying to ask a question.
No, I'm not going to. 'cause I'm
John?
not sure how to-
Yes, go ahead.
This is Margaret. I just want to tell that his father died October 23rd, 1937.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Margaret.
Sure.
That's what I love. See, we all have, where's mine at? And we all have these magic lamps in our pockets or our purses, and all we have to do is rub it, and out come the genie. Hey, genie, I want this answer, and boom, there it is. Don't be afraid to use it. Anybody else have anything you'd like to add to this conversation we have going here about the early years?
I don't know. Let me just do chat. Can you hear me, John?
I sure can.
Oh, great. Okay. My husband read all 3 of, is it Cato?
Trilogy.
The trilogy?
Yeah, Carol.
Of
I think there's
Caro.
actually more volumes now.
Oh,
The last
interesting.
one was Master of the Senate.
And then he goes, and he's working. I'm finish what you're saying, and then I'll add what I was going to add.
Okay. Oh, I guess he does, Butch just wanted to mention that he had
Okay.
read the books.
Okay.
I have read, and she came to our school to talk about it, Doris Kearns Godwin's book, which
good one,
paints
good
a
one.
very different picture
Yeah, no doubt.
from
No
what
doubt.
what
What
you're
I'm-
talking about.
Oh, I know. Keep going.
And the only other thing I would like to say at this point is I was a sophomore when Kennedy was shot.
Mhm.
And I was also on the debate team.
Mhm.
And one of my male co-debaters, right after this happened, came to say LBJ was behind it. And of
Mhm.
course, the rest of us went, no, that couldn't possibly be. Why would he do that?
Mhm.
And now I'm hearing this case that you're presenting and finding it even more interesting.
Okay.
That somehow my young colleague in school knew way more than
Yeah.
most people.
You know, and he may, your colleague may have just, it may have just been a, what's the word I want to say? It may have been an emotional connection that he did there. He may not have, because there would not have been at this time any evidence to support that opinion. I will mention.
Well, what I'm wondering is, because this particular person was well versed on LBJ for whatever reason, and I don't know what that was, as a sophomore in high school, that he must have had some inkling of LBJ being capable of something like that.
Oh, very good. Yeah, and that's possible. You know, one thing I will mention, at this time, it wasn't, I think it was 65 or 66, there was a very successful play off Broadway called Macbird, and it was treating LBJ as Macbeth. And so they got it right, even though they were just doing it as a satirical theater piece that was very popular at the time. But everybody said, well, that's a lark. But time has shown that LBJ, I think, I'm making the argument that was the mastermind behind it. And that play was an early, had prescience about that. I will go back to, and I don't want to you know, I don't support Doris Kearns Goodwin's. I think she's a highly compromised historian, and in particular with her subject of LBJ. I don't want to get into why she was compromised, but in order to get close to him, she got close to him. And she presents a very favorable image of him that clearly is not what you're hearing this afternoon.
Right, right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Just could we all mute our computers while you're talking?
Oh, okay. All right.
I wanted to say, this is Penny, and I wanted to say, I was in the 7th grade when Kennedy got assassinated, and my mom and I were watching it on TV, and I told her at the time, I said, I think Johnson did it, and she just was like, you know, I mean, I had, you know, and she's like, oh no, he's the vice president, you know, and I. But you know, I said, I don't know, just the look of him. I said, the way he's had the look on his face, you know, and it was just, I mean, I didn't have anything to go on other than feeling, you know, but I kind of got that same idea. I never have cared for LBJ at all.
Well, you just had prescience. I will say this, historically, and by that I'm saying reaching back thousands of years, the person who assumes the throne is most often the person who has poured the poison or plunged the dagger. So LBJ's in company with most historical assassins who assume the throne. Well, let's continue here, shall we? Let me just reduce my gallery here. And let's talk about the Senate years, because this is when LBJ is just going to rake in the dough. Let me just back up. I think I got that. There we go. Throughout his political career, LBJ solicited campaign funds, political favors, and payback. And we're going to be looking at this both this week and especially in episode 3 next Monday. Now, one such incident came to light as a result of a Securities and Exchange Commission lawsuit involving a lobbyist who testified about Gulf Oil commitment to furnish Johnson $50,000 for personal use. And I will say this, $50,000 was the going rate for LBJ. If you wanted anything to move forward, either as a corporation or for a law going forward, it's $50,000 in cash. Now, the lobbyist delivered the money to one of various henchmen at this time, Walter Jenkins, who was his chief of staff, Cliff Carter, John Connolly, and Ed Clark, who is his attorney. And here is an image of Ed Clark. And when asked how much money Gulf had contributed, this is during this SEC investigation, oh, I know of about 200,000. And Gulf was only one oil company. And there were non-oil businesses in Texas too. So, you know, you can just well imagine how much money just started to roll in. 1956, columnist Drew Pearson managed to acquire copies of an investigation into LBJ's financial misconduct. I mean, he wasn't getting away with this, but they couldn't really bring him to task. One set of documents included IRS records that showed Brown and Root paid their employees bonuses with the understanding that they were to immediately deposit them and send the same amount to one of Johnson's campaign funds. How about that? And here's an image of Drew Pearson. And I just have to laugh when I see this photograph of him at his desk right there. How this guy could get anything done with so much paper cluttering around him, though. Although I did have a grandfather of mine, he had a desk like that, and I always baffled me how you can achieve anything but stacks of things. Anyway, at some point, LBJ decided to separate his illegal business transactions into two groups. And there were those he had to manage personally, and those he could delegate to his sidekick, Bobby Baker, who we see shown here, from which he would collect a skim that was just too small in nature to occupy his mind and time. Major decisions, such as Brown and Root style favors and high-level appointments and awards of defense contracts and legislative initiatives, these would all be under his control because that was all $50,000. So this is going to put LBJ in touch with this group here, you know, organized crime. And I love this image that I've selected here. This is anachronistic. This, of course, is from the 20s. But I thought it was just so good. Had all those good old boys there just have to cover their faces up. Among LBJ's clients were hoodlums and tainted labor leaders, such as Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa, who belonged to organized crime, the very existence of which was denied by J. Edgar Hoover. What organized crime? There is no organized crime in America. It's worth noting that LBJ's neighbor in DC, as I'm speaking of across the street neighbor, was indeed the FBI director. One of Johnson's longest-term crime contacts, Jack Halpin, he ran a gambling syndicate in Houston, and he was conducting payoffs to organized crime of $100,000 a week before he was imprisoned on income tax fraud. But I have to ask, how much was Jack Halpin pulling in, you know, a week if he was able to pay out $100,000 in bribes and keep on going? Well, during his trial, Halpin refused to reveal who else he had been paying off. Later acknowledged that he had business dealings with LBJ, stating that during a 10-year period from the 50s, he had given Johnson $500,000 in cash and campaign contributions. And Johnson, in return, whenever he took something, he always gave something in return. And what he gave in return were killing anti-rackets legislation he would water down bills that he could not defeat, or he would curb congressional investigations. And he would do this from his rising power in the Senate. In addition, LBJ expropriated campaign funds that were flowing through the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. That's the official campaign committee for Senate. Both for his own campaigns and those for senator candidates that he wanted to control. That's how he would, because all these guys are always hunting around for money. So if Johnson managed to get some money to them, they were beholden to him. And in general, it was for his own personal and unreported use. And these abuses were eventually reported in Life magazine in a big spread on LBJ and Bobby Baker. Unfortunately, that issue was slated for November 22nd, 1963. The article described a senator who caught Johnson and Bobby shortchanging him. One Western candidate was bitter in 1958 when Baker offered him $3,000 in cash. This candidate happened to know that the donor had handed him $25,000 and that 12 of that was earmarked for him. You don't need it, Baker told him bluntly. You're doing all right. And there they are, Johnson on the right and Baker on the left. They were a dynamic duo in the Senate in DC at this time. So who is Bobby Baker? Well, when he was first elected to the Senate, LBJ established a close relationship with the 20-year-old Page, the boy who knew where all the bodies were buried, and that's why Johnson sidled up to him. And Baker would become more than an aide or protege to Johnson. Their relationship would become so close that Johnson would say, if I had a son, it would be Bobby Baker. Johnson, in fact, will have a son, although it will be outside of his marriage. But we'll deal with that in another episode. Baker would become, along with Walter Jenkins, John Connolly, Cliff Carter, and Ed Clark, one of the many bagmen and intermediaries that Johnson would rely upon to disguise his relationship with criminals. See, the one thing that I think Johnson learned when he first came to Congress was, how did these other congressmen who obviously are on the take, how did they mess up? It's because they had a direct relationship. And Johnson said, I need to create a wall between me and them. And all these characters that you see listed here and others would provide that plausible deniability for Johnson. So they're the ones that are picking up the cash, stuffing it into their suit pockets and their briefcases, and flying it up to DC from Austin. You know, the recent Senator Menendez from New Jersey, he should have studied LBJ. And he got caught, of course, with all this cash in his own suit pockets. That's the lesson that LBJ was teaching all these guys. Don't handle the money yourself. But here's where we're really going to see, look at this smile on LBJ here. This is his rags to riches story about to go forward now. The primary source of his accumulation of wealth beyond this modest salary as congressman and senator were the radio and television broadcasting stations that he had acquired, beginning with the little old Austin radio station of KTBC in 1943 for $17.5. Now, in his book, Lone Star Rising, again, historian Robert Dallek chronicles how Johnson grew this initial investment into a multi-million-dollar family corporation in just a few years. Here's how he would do it. He used his position and contacts in the FCC. Remember, this is where he was placing a lot of his boys to obtain licenses, additional radio and VHF television stations, approvals for increasing the station's broadcasting power, and in general to just, expand his operation with that nasty regulatory interference. Now, during this time, Johnson was the acknowledged power behind the ascendancy of his radio and TV empire, but he consistently denied it. And he tried to credit their growth to the little ladybird. This is her little project over here. I got nothing to do with it. But indeed, LBJ, his use of political influence to expand his business would cement a lifelong relationship with his attorney, Ed Clark, who would become the most powerful attorney in Texas. And here's what Clark's business was doing. It was chasing down all these multinational corporations and hitting them up for advertising dollars. So, for instance, General Electric and other corporations were intended to advertise on KTBC. And of course, these outfits say, why in the world would we ever want to advertise on that rinky-dink station down there? And of course, they would be put in the wise. If you want anything on your behalf ever to happen in Washington, you will buy advertising on KTBC. And they got the message. That is how you wanted to secure a favor. It's by advertising. Whether that advertising played or not, you paid into that pot on his station. He had a perfect way to launder money. Here's an example. In 42, before the Johnsons bought the station, the monthly advertising revenue was $2,600 a month. But right after they bought it, in December 43, suddenly it just, jacked up 100%. Now it's $5,600 a month. In 44, it was $13,500. In 45, it was $15,300. And by war's end in 46, they're clearing $22,700 a month in advertising. And that's all from selling groceries and washing machines. Huh? Johnson was selling political influence as fast as he could get that cash to roll in. But let's take a look at what I call his superpower. His strength was in manipulating people. We saw that go right back to when he's at San Marcos. He was innately talented at forming psychological blueprints of his targets, categorizing their strengths and weaknesses, backgrounds, characteristics such as intelligence, attitude, and prejudices. I'm not sure Johnson ever cracked a book while he was at school. I know he never cracked a book when he left school. What his talent was in reading people, reading their weaknesses, and exploiting their weaknesses. Hubert Humphrey served as his VP, observed this. Johnson always was able to take the measure of the man. He knew those he could dominate. He knew those he could outmaneuver. Right off the bat, he sized you up. And I guess if anybody would know that, it would be Hubert Humphrey. Huh? What Humphrey did not say was that the real key to LBJ's mastery of other people's future action was his knowledge of their past secrets. The key to that hidden information was his access to his neighbor's most personal and confidential files. J. Edgar Hoover provided LBJ with ample evidence to use as ammunition against friends and foes alike. We should all have a neighbor like like Hoover across the street, huh? Well, during Johnson's 12 years as senator, having risen to become minority leader after 4 and then majority leader after 2, he acquired almost as much power as the president. And doesn't he look like it there in that image? he's sitting in the catbird seat there. He was willing to cast aside moral or ethical considerations to attain more. He could not ever get enough. One of the most revealing and troubling insights to this part of his character was in Caro's biography. Johnson's hunger was for power in its most naked form, for power not to improve the lives of others, but to manipulate and dominate them, to bend them to his will. It was a hunger so fierce and consuming that no consideration of morality or ethics, nor cost to himself or to anyone else, could stand before it. It was an obsession. Therefore, becoming vice president would have represented a giant step backwards, unless the office was seen as Johnson saw it. It was a stepping stone on his path to the presidency. Johnson recognized, and I'll deal with this more in episode 4, recognized that as a Southerner, particularly someone who had been such an obstructionist to civil rights legislation in the 50s, was never going to be elected to that office. But he was willing to step down from a powerful position to get on the ticket as a vice president, and that might serve him as a backdoor option. And that's why he moves toward the vice presidency. Now, I'll deal more with this, as I said, in chapter 4, but I want to at least hit on this portion of his time since we're looking at his biography here. During the early months of Kennedy's administration, Johnson liked to wander the White House, as if he was going on important business. And I'm gonna stop right here. I don't know if any of you know the name of John Nance Garner. He was the vice president for 2 terms under FDR. And why do we never hear of John Nance Garner? Well, except for one thing. John Nance Garner had a wonderful expression. He said of the vice presidency, "It isn't worth a bucket of warm piss." But Johnson has aspired to that warm bucket of piss, and now he's got to handle it. So what he would do is he would come to the White House and snoop around, reading people and attempting to insinuate himself into current events. And though it seemed innocent enough, his morning routine was always calculated. His chauffeur would drop him off at the front gates of the White House. He walked through them, and then he'd go immediately into the West Wing. Often, if the president was in the Oval Office, he'd peek in and see what was on the desk until he was shooed out by the president's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. And then, and only then, would he go out the back door and head over to his office in the adjacent executive office building. Now, he may have had many reasons for such an itinerary, but clearly he hoped to learn as much as possible about whatever was going on in the Oval Office, because Kennedy and his staff was not keeping LBJ informed. I don't know whether you've heard this really cutting remark, but so many of the people who came to JFK's staff were recent graduates of Harvard, and they referred to Senator Johnson, or now Vice President Johnson, as Uncle Rufus Cornpone. They had a lot of disregard for him and for Lady Bird as well. And that didn't sit well. LBJ had an enormous ego, but it was extremely fragile. He saw not only real slights, but imagined ones as well. And he never learned to ignore either one. In this photograph, we see him with Clark Clifford. Now, Clifford would eventually become Johnson's Secretary of the Defense once McNamara stepped down. But he told Clark how he seethed over an incident that occurred while he was sitting in the reception area outside of the Oval Office, just waiting to see JFK. Suddenly, Bobby Kennedy walks through that room and he just bursts right into the Oval Office and closes the door behind him without ever greeting Johnson or even acknowledging him. But given Johnson and Bobby Kennedy's relationship, it was one of bitterness and animosity. It's curious that he let such a minor slight get to him, but there it is. Now, much has been written about this long-term feud between Bobby Kennedy, seen on the left, and Johnson here, but little is known about how he really felt about the president. Now, many authors thought that the two men basically liked each other, yet acknowledged that JFK's tolerance of LBJ was tenuous at best, which was evidenced by Johnson steadily decreasing in the White House meetings. And one thing, and I'll deal with this in a later episode, but I'll mention it right here. Kennedy did not like having Johnson around, and he was continually sending him on foreign trips to act as his dignitary without portfolio. So Johnson did more than 20 foreign journeys, and he hated every one that he was on. But that kept him out of the White House. However, in the spring of 1960, so this is during campaign season, okay? Peter Lisagor, who was a Chicago Daily News reporter and a regular pundit at that time on Face the Nation, he was talking with Johnson on a plane ride, perhaps even a campaign plane ride, or maybe he was just going back to DC with him. Well, Lisagor repeated this conversation to Robert Kennedy, and evidently that conversation also was captured by historian Robert Dallek, and Robert Dallek presents it for our value here. All of the enmity and hostility that Johnson held for the Kennedys came out in that conversation. Johnson described Jack as a little scrawny fella with rickets. God knows what other kind of diseases. Johnson predicted that Jack's election would give Joe Kennedy control of the country and would make his little brother Secretary of Labor. And when Lisagor finished, 4-letter words in all, Bobby turned to the window and said, "Wow, I knew he hated Jack, but I didn't think he hated him that much." And this image here, I think, kind of tells the distance between these two men. And of course, this is going to beg the question, if they didn't get along, why did John Kennedy ever offer him that place on his ticket to run for vice presidency? We'll deal with that in episode 4. But that concludes today's presentation of Johnson's maniacal obsession. And let me close out my screen here and get back into a gallery view with you here and try and address some of your thoughts on what we've just discovered here. I know this isn't the Doris Kearns Goodwin biography of JFK, and it's hardly the Robert Caro version either, but there it is.
John?
Talking
Yes.
about
Go ahead, Margaret.
standard.
Oh, I've got.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We'll get Margaret go first and then Beverly, okay?
Okay.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that a lot of what you have discussed about Johnson was actually known during his rise and his Senate years and then as vice president, because I'm old enough to remember that. And I remember my parents, particularly my dad, who was very political, talking about these very things about Johnson and how he was getting away with all this and the political expediency of why Kennedy put him on the ticket, etc. So it wasn't that it wasn't known. For some reason, though, it was tolerated, I guess.
Well, we'll get into more of that next week. And I'll give a little tease on this. The title, even though it's on your syllabus right there is called Sex, Scams, and Murder. So we're going to go deep into LBJ's crimes, but we'll do that next week. I'm just kind of giving you the overview of his life here as a politician, and we'll get into the dirty deeds next week, which, as you had pointed out here, Margaret, were known at the time, but they became more prominently known in 1962 and 1963 in particular, first with the Billy Saul Estes scandal and then the Bobby Baker scandal. But I think people in Texas knew all these things about Johnson at the time. If you wanted to know who your electoral representative was, they knew who Johnson was.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm from New York, and even in New York, they were talking about it at the time.
Okay, thank you. Beverly, what you got?
When you were talking about Johnson's standard fee was $50,000. In 1950, which is close to the year, $50,000 is $624,000 in today's dollars. So it was a lot of money.
Wow. Can you see someone trying to stick $650,000 in cash in their suit, which is what Connolly did when he was flying up from Austin to DC? That's a lot of moolah.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Beverly. That's good. I like that.
Muted again.
Hey, John,
Yes, go ahead.
Butch Wilson here.
Hey,
Was
Butch.
there any chronicled discussions about who would be on the ticket as vice president for 64?
Yes, we'll get into that. Again, a lot of this will be in episode. I don't want to get too much into episode 4. I'm going to deal with this in a lot of details, Butch. I will talk about both the 1960 choice of Johnson as vice president, and then what John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were trying to do to eliminate him from the 64 ticket. And that specifically relates to Billy Saul Estes and Bobby Baker.
Yeah, I'm just seeing, I'm always looking for parallels to today. And when people are more concerned about being reelected than they are about doing the right thing, that could be a motive for murder. Just saying.
Well, the other thing, and I'll mention this, the one thing that got Johnson impelling him, there were two things impelling Johnson to be on that 60 ticket outside of his own maniacal obsession. One of these was he knew, because he had had a massive heart attack in the mid-50s. His father would not live long. This was his moment in the sun. He had to get in at this time, because if he had to wait till 68 to run, presuming that JFK would be reelected, he would be too old and his health would be so fragile. The second thing working on Johnson is what's known as the 20-year curse. Ever since President Harrison, every 20 years, the elected president would die in office, either by illness or assassination. And as Johnson said, I like them odds. So,
thanks.
Good. Rebecca, looks like you want to say something, girl. What is it?
No, not really. However, the Atlantic, a recent copy of the magazine has like a 20-some page article about the secrets of the assassination archive, and they really are. They're really discussing what the CIA did and how they totally messed up that report and deliberately.
Oh, that's absolutely.
It's really interesting.
And that's
It
in the
certainly
current,
went right along with what you were saying.
is that the current issue of Atlantic?
It came out, I think the 9th. Yeah,
Okay.
November the 9th.
Okay, well, that's appropriate. That's indeed
Yes.
that we're all part of. A lot of us are working in this anniversary mindset, so people are
Right.
open to it and looking at it. Yeah, the problem is when it isn't just the CIA. You'll see what the FBI was doing, and there's one book that I have. It's by Vince Palmara, who has really focused on the Secret Service. It's called I'm blanking on its title right now, but I can read about 2 pages in that book and I want to throw it against the wall when you see the abuse of the Secret Service toward the president at that time. And of course, afterwards, the president told us he didn't want this. He didn't want us to be hanging on so close to him. Of course, the president's dead. He's not there to argue with them anymore. So, but thank you for mentioning that, Rebecca. Okay. Anybody else? Craig, you're awful quiet here today, brother. Anything? Or Peter? Or Lori? I feel like I'm a junior high school substitute teacher and I'm just calling on people at the back of the classroom.
The only thing I would comment is I went to his museum, LBJ's museum, and there are a set of phones there where you can pick up and hear him talking to different people. And one of the persons is Jackie Kennedy.
Oh my God.
And you know what I'm saying? He's so sympathetic to her and so sorry. And how can he help her with her grief? And it's just horrible.
Okay, you know, you use the word sympathetic. I've not been to the library, but I have heard those recordings, and he is so icky. He wants Jackie. I mean, I'm not gonna get into this in this course, but LBJ is a sexual predator, and he is going after Jackie Kennedy at this time. And come on, honey, just anytime you want, come on by the White House. Let me put my arm around you and comfort you. It is so sick. And she was being nice, you know, being pleasant with him, being civil with him. But when she hung up that phone, you know, she turned to, you know, usually it was Robert Kennedy in the room, and she was telling what was going on with that right there. It's just awful. You know, this man's predation did not end with the assassination. It was going on. Thank you for mentioning that, Lord.
Yeah, I just remember it vividly.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Hey, John, it's Bob Rodwiller here.
Hey, Bob.
The last week when you talked about the two Oswalds, there's a Lee Oswald and a Harvey Oswald. I just came upon a YouTube video the other day. It was yesterday, I think it was, and was showing it to Kathy. And the person who was describing that period, that action down in Dallas, they referred to as Lee Oswald and not Harvey. You made a distinction between the two. So I think goes again with your statement that there were two Oswalds. The one who was an army officer who could speak fluent Russian in New York, came in from being over with in Russia as in contract. He was probably a DIA kind of a guy, I guess. And he was the one who could speak fluent Russian. And then there was Lee Harvey Oswald, who was just in the Marine Corps for 4 years and kind of set up kind of the way it was set up. So it had the same kind of the same approach.
I will, Bob, I'm going to get into that specifically. You know, the famous episode 4, it looks like I'm jam-packed with so many things on it. But at that time, I will talk about this, and usually I accompany it in the show notes by a conversation with the researcher who did that work. His name is John Armstrong, in his massive work called Harvey and Lee. And I may, in advance of that, I may add that link in today's show notes to listen to, because the Harvey Oswald and the Lee Oswald are living almost simultaneous lives. One has the real mother of Lee Oswald, which is, I'm blanking on her name at the moment here, and the other one is being raised by an imposter. Well, I won't get too far into it, but And that's what makes this whole thing work. They were not in this project that they were, I'll call it the Oswald project, was not about, advanced planning for an assassination. It goes back to the early 50s when CIA counterintelligence was trying to insert sleeper agents into the Soviet Union. And there's upwards of like 40 that we're trying to introduce to get essentially human intelligence. And the Soviets knew these guys were sleeper agents, and they sequestered them in minor towns. None of them were in Moscow. In the case of Oswald, he landed in Minsk in Belarus, so he was never going to find out what was happening in Moscow. And the person for the CIA who masterminded this program is head of counterintelligence, James Angleton. He started calling all these guys back within 6 to 8 months because he knew it was a failed program. But Harvey Oswald said, I'm going to stay here because I'm gathering information for a book that I want to write. And so he landed there in 59, but he came back in 62 on the insistence of Angleton because, as I said, I have a new project for you. So that's when Oswald will come back in 62, bringing a wife and a child with him, Marina and the child. But more on that as we get to that episode. Anybody else?
Yeah, John, this is Kathy
Go
again.
ahead, Kathy.
I can't help but I have read all the Caro books as well. Maybe not the latest ones, but Lady Bird is an enigma to me in terms of in the Caro books, I understood that she kind of knew he was that kind of slimy guy, but that didn't seem to bother her or didn't change her life in a way that tried to correct it. I'm always interested in the female perspective, obviously, and how are you going to live with that?
Indeed, she's an enabler. She knew everything, both in his financial misdeeds and his sexual misdeeds that was going on, and she just turned a blind eye to it. But she knew everything that was going on. I've heard Caro talk because people talk to. He said, "We know this is going on. Why did you never talk to her about it?" And he said, "I didn't have the nerve to ask her about it." And so Caro backed down instead of addressing it with Lady Bird. But Lady Bird knew everything.
Got to.
Anybody else? We've got. I think we've stirred the water here with LBJ here. And it just, I said, it just gets darker. Particularly next week, we're going to really see where he's got blood on his hands. So the assassination of the president isn't the first murder that he's associated with, and it's done at his order. They are done. There's not one murder; it's several murders that are done at LBJ's insistence. Because LBJ doesn't want anything coming back to him, and that's why he's got this coterie of henchmen around him who will go out and execute these people on his behalf.
Just like the movie did today. Flowers on the Sun.
Right. Yeah. Well, anything else? All right. Well, I won't keep you. I'll let you out of school a little bit early today, and you will have this as recorded in case you want to view it. I will put together show notes, send them forward to Sandra, who will forward them to you with the recording, and you can take a look. Usually what I'll do is I'll put in a link to listen to something else. As I mentioned, listen to John Armstrong talk about the two Oswald, the Harvey and the Lee Oswald. And it's a fascinating explication of what had happened. And it helps us to understand how, because there's these reports of two seemingly different people in the same space. And this makes total sense of that. So we can understand it. Because one thing, again, I'll give you a spoiler. This is a spoiler alert. On the day of the killing, the coup d'etat, both Oswalds are in the Texas School Book Depository. Lee knows that. Harvey doesn't know that Lee's in the building, though. But Lee knows Harvey's in the building.
Is
But
he
we're-
there? Is he there
Can he hear
to
you?
deal with these, the book that he was supposedly writing you were just talking about?
No, Lee Oswald, he's over there trying to write, he's over in the Soviet Union gathering information about how the Soviet Union works in late 1950s, 60s, because we had at that time, the only thing that we had were overflights from U-2. And so these are high-level folks that don't tell us anything. What we were trying to do is get human intelligence. How much does bread cost? How do people pay their rent? What's on the shelves at the store? We were trying to get a picture of how the Soviet Union works. So in case we were able to place an agent in the Soviet Union, they would know how to operate without looking stupid. Now, the Soviets are doing the same thing here. They have sleeper agents here that are gathering information about this is where you pick up the bus, this is where you rent a house, this is where you go get toothpaste, and all this day-to-day stuff that you need to know to blend into a society. And these are why these sleeper agents were sent over there. And Harvey Oswald stayed there because he was gathering this kind of information. And when he came back, he had pages and pages of notes taped to his body so that it would not be removed from his luggage. And then he had those notes transcribed into text for him to read from. But he never ended up, I can't say that that book eventually was published, or his notes of that experience, but not while he was alive.
So you're saying that both the Oswalds knew each other?
Yes, they did. And their families knew each other. But Harvey Oswald, the one who's going to be set up to be the patsy, he doesn't know that his doppelganger, Lee, is in the Texas School Book Depository with him on November 22nd. I'll get into that. We deal with episode 6. I'll show you where they were at and how they were moving around and how both of them left the building and where they went.
Wow.
Amazing. Amazing.
Sounds like a wonderful movie.
There's the problem. No studio, because the studios, as are all the major electronic media, are in bed with the government. They're not making this movie. They're not even. You're not gonna see this on CBS or the Wall Street Journal or anything. You gotta come to an OLLI class and find out about these authors who have gone in and done the research. People like Philip Nelson and James Douglas and Douglas Horn, who's also on your resource list right there, who served on the Assassination Records and Review Board. Because one of the also horrible things is when we get in to talk about the autopsy, it's just what I'm going to reveal about the autopsy is I know how you're going to respond to that, because you don't know anything about it. You know the public story, and that is a big fat lie.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
good care of yourself, and we'll see you next Monday. I want to thank Sandra again for riding shotgun with us, even with her 4 dogs back there, and for recording and sharing this with you. I look forward to being with you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
John. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.